there alone.
Hey everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev. Each episode we read about 30 minutes out of history book together, and we are finishing chapter 13 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We previously read about silencing socialists, the women's suffrage movement, a little bit about trying to fight against child labor, to put child labor laws in place. And now we are going to finish up reading about black people in the early part of the century. Black women faced double oppression. A Negro nurse wrote to a newspaper in 1912, "We poor colored women wage earners in the South are fighting a terrible battle. On the one hand, we are assailed by black men who should be our natural protectors, and whether in the cook kitchen, at the wash tub, over the sewing machine, behind the baby carriage, or at the ironing board, we are but little more than pack horses, beasts of burden, slaves." In this early part of the 20th century, labeled by generations of white scholars as the Progressive Period, lynchings were reported every week. It was the low point for Negroes, North and South, the nadir, as Rayford Logan, a black historian, put it. In 1910, there were 10 million Negroes in the United States, and 9 million of them were in the South. The government of the United States, between 1901 and 1921, the presidents were Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson. Whether Republican or Democrat, watched Negroes being lynched, observed murderous riots against blacks in Statesboro, Georgia, Brownsville, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia, and did nothing. There were Negroes in the Socialist Party, but the Socialist Party did not go much out of its way to act on the race question. As Ray Ginger writes of Debs, when race prejudice was thrust at Debs, he always publicly repudiated it. He always insisted on absolute equality, but he failed to accept the view that special measures were sometimes needed to achieve this equality. Blacks began to organize. A National Afro-American Council formed in 1903 to protest against lynching, peonage, discrimination, disenfranchisement. The National Association of Colored Women, formed around the same time, condemned segregation and lynchings. In Georgia in 1906, there was an Equal Rights Convention which pointed to 260 Georgia Negroes lynched since 1885. It asked the right to vote, the right to enter the militia, and the right to be on juries. It agreed blacks should work hard, and at the same time we must agitate, complain, protest, and keep protesting against the invasion of our manhood rights. W.E.B. Du Bois, teaching in Atlanta, Georgia in 1905, sent out a letter to Negro leaders throughout the country calling them to a conference just across the Canadian border from Buffalo near Niagara Falls. It was the start of the Niagara movement. Du Bois, born in Massachusetts, the first black to receive a Ph.D. degree from Harvard University in 1895, had just written and published his poetic, powerful book, The Souls of Black Folk. Du Bois was a socialist sympathizer, although only briefly a party member. One of his associates in calling the Niagara meeting was William Monroe Trotter, a young man in Boston of militant views who edited a weekly newspaper, The Guardian. I don't think that's any association with the English paper, The Guardian. Maybe it is. I don't know. In it, he attacked the moderate ideas of Booker T. Washington. When in the summer of 1903, Washington spoke to an audience of 2,000 at a Boston church, Trotter and his supporters prepared 9 provocative questions, which caused a commotion and led to fistfights. Trotter and a friend were arrested. This may have added to the spirit of indignation which led Du Bois to spearhead the Niagara meeting. The tone of the Niagara group was strong. We refuse to allow the impression to remain that the Negro American assents to inferiority, is submissive under oppression, and apologetic before insults. Through helplessness we may submit, but the voice of protest of 10 million Americans must never cease to assail the ears of their fellows so long as America is unjust. A race riot in Springfield, Illinois prompted the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1910. Whites dominated the leadership of the new organization. Du Bois was the only black officer. He was also the first editor of the NAACP periodical, The Crisis. The NAACP concentrated on legal action and education, but Du Bois represented in it that spirit which was embodied in the Niagara Movement's declaration, persistent manly agitation is the way to liberty. What was clear in this period to blacks, to feminists, to labor organizers and socialists, was that they could not count on the government, on the national government. True, this was the progressive period, the start of the age of reform, but it was a reluctant reform, aimed at quieting the popular risings, not making fundamental changes. What gave it the name progressive was that new laws were passed. Under Theodore Roosevelt, there was the Meat Inspection Act, the Hepburn Act, to regulate railroads and pipelines, a Pure Food and Drug Act. Under Taft, the Mann-Elkins Act put telephone and telegraph systems under the regulation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. In Woodrow Wilson's presidency, the Federal Trade Commission was introduced to control the growth of monopolies, and the Federal Reserve Act to regulate the country's money and banking system. And I do believe they failed. Under Taft were proposed the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, allowing a graduated income tax, and the 17th Amendment providing for the election of senators directly by popular vote instead of by the state legislatures as the original Constitution provided. Also at this time, a number of states passed laws regulating wages and hours, providing for safety inspection of factories and compensation for injured workmen. It was a time of public investigations aimed at soothing protest. In 1913, the Pujo Committee of Congress studied the concentration of power in the banking industry, and the Commission on Industrial Relations of the Senate held hearings on labor management conflict. Undoubtedly, ordinary people benefited to some extent from these changes. The system was rich, productive, complex. It could give enough of a share of its riches to enough of the working class to create a protective shield between the bottom and the top of the society. You hear that a lot from Howard Zinn. They gave just enough to just enough of the people to keep them from rebelling. A study of immigrants in New York between 1905 and 1915 finds that 32% of Italians and Jews rose out of the manual class to higher levels, although not to much higher levels. But it was also true that many Italian immigrants did not find the opportunities inviting enough for them to stay. In one 4-year period, 73 Italians left New York for every 100 that arrived. Interesting. Still, enough Italians became construction workers, enough Jews became businessmen and professionals to create a middle-class cushion for class conflict. That was a little stereotype right there, wasn't it? Fundamental conditions did not change, however, for the vast majority of tenant farmers, factory workers, slum dwellers, miners, farm laborers, working men and women, black and white. Robert Weber sees in the progressive movement an attempt by the system to adjust to changing conditions in order to achieve more stability. Through rules with impersonal sanctions, it sought continuity and predictability in a world of endless change. It assigned far greater power to government, and it encouraged the centralization of authority. Harold Faulkner concluded that this new emphasis on strong government was for the benefit of the most powerful economic group. Of course it was. Gabriel Kolko calls it the emergence of political capitalism, where the businessmen took firmer control of the political system because the private economy was not efficient enough to forestall protest from below. The businessmen, Kolko says, were not opposed to the new reforms. They initiated them, pushed them to stabilize the capitalist system in a time of uncertainty and trouble. For instance, Theodore Roosevelt made a reputation for himself as a trust buster, although his successor Taft, a conservative, while Roosevelt was a progressive, launched more antitrust suits than did Roosevelt. Excuse me. In fact, as Weber points out, two of J.P. Morgan's men, Elbert Gary, chairman of U.S. Steel, and George Perkins, who would later become a campaigner for Roosevelt, arranged a general understanding with Roosevelt by which they would cooperate in any investigation by the Bureau of Corporations in return for a guarantee of their company's legality. They would do this through private negotiations with the president. A gentleman's agreement between reasonable people, Weave says, with a bit of sarcasm. The Panic of 1907, as well as the growing strength of the socialists, wobblies, and trade unions, speeded the process of reform, according to Weeb. Around 1908, a qualitative shift in outlook occurred among large numbers of these men of authority. The emphasis was now on enticements and compromises. It continued with Wilson, and a great many reform-minded citizens indulged the illusion of a progressive fulfillment. What radical critics now say of those reforms was said at the time by the Banker's magazine. As the business of the country has learned the secret of combination, it is gradually subverting the power of the politician and rendering him subservient to its purposes. There was much to stabilize, much to protect. By 1904, 318 trusts with capital of more than $7 billion controlled 40% of the U.S. manufacturing. $7 billion is a lot of money now. Back in 1904, I don't have the math to tell you how much that would equal adjusted for inflation now, but that's a lot more money in 1904. In 1909, a manifesto of the new progressivism appeared, a book called The Promise of American Life by Herbert Crowley, editor of the New Republic and an admirer of Theodore Roosevelt. He saw the need for discipline and regulation if the American system were to continue. Government should do more, he said, and he hoped to see the sincere and enthusiastic imitation He hoped to see the sincere and enthusiastic imitation of heroes and saints, by whom he may have meant Theodore Roosevelt. Richard Hofstadter, in his biting chapter on the man the public saw as the great lover of nature and physical fitness, the war hero, the boy scout in the White House, says, the admirers to whom Roosevelt listened were almost exclusively representatives of industrial and finance capital. Men like Hanna, Robert Bacon, and George W. Perkins of the House of Morgan, Elihu Root, Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, and James Stillman of the Rockefeller interests. Which is interesting because Roosevelt had a famous quotation about corporate interests in government. You should look that up. I won't tell you. I'll keep it a secret. Responding to his worried brother-in-law, writing from Wall Street, Roosevelt replied, I intend to be more conservative, but in the interests of the corporations themselves and above all in the interests of the country. Roosevelt supported the regulatory Hepburn Act because he feared something worse. He wrote to Henry Cabot Lodge that the railroad lobbyists who opposed the bill were wrong. I think they are very short-sighted not to understand that to beat it means to increase the movement for government ownership of the railroads. His action against the trusts was to induce them to accept government regulation in order to prevent destruction. He prosecuted the Morgan Railroad monopoly in the Northern Security case, considering it an antitrust victory, but it hardly changed anything, and although the Sherman Act provided for criminal penalties, there was no prosecution of the men who had planned the monopoly: Morgan, Harriman, Hill. As for Woodrow Wilson, Hofstadter points out he was a conservative from the start. As a historian and political scientist, Wilson wrote, in politics, nothing radically novel may safely be attempted. He urged slow and gradual change. His attitude toward labor, Hofstadter says, was generally hostile, and he spoke of the crude and ignorant minds of the populists. James Weinstein has studied the reforms of the progressive period, especially the process by which business and government, sometimes with the aid of labor leaders, worked out the legislative changes they thought necessary. Weinstein sees a conscious and successful effort to guide and control the economic and social policies of federal, state, and municipal governments by various business groupings in their own long-range interests. While the original impetus for reform came from protesters and radicals in the current century, particularly on the federal level, few reforms were enacted without the tacit approval, if not the guidance, of the large corporate interests. These interests assembled liberal reformers and intellectuals to aid them in such matters. Weinstein's definition of liberalism as a means of stabilizing the system in the interests of big business is different from that of the liberals themselves. Arthur Schlesinger writes, liberalism in America has been ordinarily the movement on the part of the other sections of society to restrain the power of the business community. Is that how you define liberalism? Put it in the comments how you define liberalism. I'd like to see it. If Schlesinger is describing the hope or intent of these other sections, he may be right. If he is describing the actual effect of these liberal reforms, that restraint has not happened. The controls were constructed skillfully. In 1900, a man named James Easley, a Republican and conservative, a school teacher and journalist, organized the National Civic Federation. Its aim was to get better relations between capital and labor. Its officers were mostly big businessmen and important national politicians, but its first vice president for a long time was Samuel Gompers of the AFL. Not all big businesses liked what the National Civic Federation was doing. Easily called these critics anarchists, opposed to the rational organization of the system. In fact, Easley wrote, our enemies are the socialists among the labor people and the anarchists among the capitalists. Are anarchists capitalists? The NCF wanted a more sophisticated approach to trade unions, seeing them as an inevitable reality, therefore wanting to come to agreements with them rather than fight with them. Better to deal with a conservative union than fight a militant one. After the Lawrence textile strike of 1912, John Golden, head of the conservative AFL textile union workers, wrote Easley that the strike had given manufacturers a very rapid education, and some of them are falling over themselves now to do business with our organization. The National Civic Federation did not represent all opinions in the business world. Actually, hold on a second. We've been talking a lot about these unions, the AFL and the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And I kind of looked up, I was trying to get some more information on the Industrial Workers of the World, and the IWW still exists, and they have a website, iww.org. Check it out. The National Civic Federation did not represent all opinions in the business world. The National Association of Manufacturers didn't want to recognize organized labor in any way. Many businessmen did not want even the puny reforms proposed by the Civic Federation, but the Federation's approach represented the sophistication and authority of the modern state, determined to do what was best for the capitalist class as a whole, even if this irritated some capitalists. The new approach was concerned with the long-range stability of the system, even at the cost, sometimes, of short-term profits. Thus, the Federation drew up a model workmen's compensation bill in 1910. And the following year, 12 states passed laws for compensation or accident insurance. When the Supreme Court said that year that New York's workmen's compensation law was unconstitutional because it deprived corporations of property without due process of law. Courts have always been impartial. Theodore Roosevelt was angry. Such decisions, he said, added immensely to the strength of the Socialist Party. By 1920, 42 states had workmen's compensation laws. As Weinstein says, it represented a growing maturity and sophistication on the part of many large corporation leaders who had come to understand, as Theodore Roosevelt had often told them, that social reform was truly conservative. As for the Federal Trade Commission, established by Congress in 1914, presumably to regulate trusts, a leader of the Civic Federation reported after several years of experience with it that it has apparently been carrying on its work with the purpose of securing the confidence of well-intentioned businessmen, members of the great corporations as well as others. In this period, cities also put through reforms, many of them giving power to city councils instead of mayors, or hiring city managers. The idea was more efficiency, more stability. The end result of the movements was to place city government firmly in the hands of the business class, Weinstein says. What reformers saw as more democracy in city government, urban historian Samuel Hayes sees as the centralization of power in fewer hands, giving businesses and professional men more direct control over city government. The progressive movement, whether led by honest reformers like Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin or disguised conservatives like Roosevelt, who was the Progressive Party candidate for president in 1912, seemed to understand it was fending off socialism. The Milwaukee Journal, a progressive organ, said the conservatives fight socialism blindly, while the progressives fight it intelligently and seek to remedy the abuses and conditions upon which it thrives. Frank Munsey, a director of U.S. Steel, writing to Roosevelt, seeing him as the best candidate for 1912, confided in him that the United States must move toward a more parental guardianship of the people, who needed the sustaining and guiding hand of the state. It was the work of the state to think for the people and plan for the people, the Steel executive said, to think for us and to plan for us. That's awfully thoughtful. But I'll think for myself. Thank you anyway. It seems quite clear that much of this intense activity for progressive reform was intended to head off socialism. Easily talked of the menace of socialism as evidenced by its growth in the colleges, churches, newspapers. In 1910, Victor Berger became the first member of the Socialist Party elected to Congress in 1911. 73 socialist mayors were elected and 1,200 lesser officials in 340 cities and towns. The press spoke of the rising tide of socialism. A privately circulated memorandum suggested to one of the departments of the National Civic Federation, in view of the rapid spread in the United States of socialistic doctrines, what was needed was a carefully planned and wisely directed effort to instruct public opinion as to the real meaning of socialism. The memorandum suggested that the campaign must be very skillfully and tactfully carried out. That it should not violently attack socialism and anarchism as such, but should be patient and pervasive and defend three ideas: individual liberty, private property, and inviolability of contract. It is hard to say how many socialists saw clearly how useful reform was to capitalism, but in 1912, a left-wing socialist from Connecticut, Robert Lamonti, wrote, "Old age pensions and insurance against sickness, accident, and unemployment are cheaper, are better business than jails, poorhouses, asylums, hospitals." He suggested that progressives would work for reforms, but socialists must make only impossible demands which would reveal the limitations of the reformers. Did the progressive reforms succeed in doing what they intended, stabilize the capitalist system by repairing its worst defects, blunt the edge of the socialist movement, restore some measure of class peace in a time of increasingly bitter clashes between capital and labor? To some extent, perhaps, but the Socialist Party continued to grow. The IWW continued to agitate, and shortly after Woodrow Wilson took office, there began in Colorado one of the most bitter and violent struggles between workers and corporate capital in the history of the country. This was the Colorado coal strike that began in September 1913 and culminated in the Ludlow massacre of April 1914. 11,000 miners in southern Colorado, mostly foreign-born, Greeks, Italians, Serbs, worked for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation, which was owned by the Rockefeller family. Aroused by the murder of one of their organizers, they went on strike against low pay, dangerous conditions, and feudal domination over their lives in towns completely controlled by the mining companies. That was feudal, not futile. Feudal domination of their lives. I'm sure you got it. Mother Jones, at this time an organizer for the United Mine Workers, came into the area, fired up the miners with her oratory, and helped them in those critical first months of the strike, until she was arrested, kept in a dungeon-like cell, and then forcibly expelled from the state. When the strike began, When the strike began, the miners were immediately evicted from their shacks in the mining towns. Aided by the United Mine Workers, they set up tents in the nearby hills and carried on the strike. The picketing from these tent colonies. The gunmen hired by the Rockefeller interests, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, using Gatling guns and rifles, raided the tent colonies. The death list of miners grew, but they hung on, drove back an armored train in a gun battle, fought to keep out strikebreakers. With the miners resisting, refusing to give in, the mines not able to operate, the Colorado governor, referred to by a Rockefeller mine manager as our little cowboy governor, called out the National Guard, with the Rockefellers supplying the Guard's wages. The miners at first thought the Guard was sent to protect them, and greeted its arrivals with flags and cheers. They soon found out the Guard was there to destroy the strike. The Guard brought strikebreakers in under cover of night, not telling them there was a strike. Guardsmen beat miners, arrested them by the hundreds, rode down with their horses parades of women in the streets of Trinidad, the central town in the area, and still the miners refused to give in. When they lasted through the cold winter of 1913 and 1914, it became clear that extraordinary measures would be needed to break the strike. In April 1914, 2 National Guard companies were stationed in the hills overlooking the largest tent colony of strikers, the one at Ludlow, housing 1,000 men, women, and children. On the morning of April 20th, a machine gun attack began on the tents. The miners fired back. Their leader, a Greek named Lou Tikas, was lured up into the hills to discuss a truce, then shot to death by a company of National Guardsmen. The women and children dug pits beneath the tents to escape the gunfire. At dusk, the Guard moved down from the hills with torches, set fire to the tents, and the families fled into the hills. 13 people were killed by gunfire. The following day, a telephone linesman going through the ruins of the Ludlow tent colony lifted an iron cot covering a pit in one of the tents and found the charred, twisted bodies of 11 children and 2 women. This became known as the Ludlow Massacre. The news spread quickly over the country. In Denver, the United Mine Workers issued a call to arms. Sorry. In Denver, the United Mine Workers issued a call to arms. Gather together for defensive purposes, all arms and ammunition legally available. 300 armed strikers marched from other tent colonies into the Ludlow area, cut telephone and telegraph wires, and prepared for battle. Railroad workers refused to take soldiers from Trinidad to Ludlow. At Colorado Springs, 300 Union miners walked off their jobs and headed for the Trinidad district carrying revolvers, rifles, shotguns. In Trinidad itself, miners attended a funeral service for the 26 dead at Ludlow, then walked from the funeral to a nearby building where arms were stacked for them. They picked up rifles and moved into the hills, destroying mines, killing mine guards, exploding mine shafts. The press reported that the hills in every direction seemed suddenly to be alive with men. In Denver, 82 soldiers in a company on a troop train headed for Trinidad refused to go. The press reported the men declared they would not engage in the shooting of women and children. They hissed the 350 men who did start and shouted imprecations at them. 5,000 people demonstrated in the rain on the lawn in front of the state capitol at Denver, asking that the National Guard officers at Ludlow be tried for murder, denouncing the governor as an accessory. The Denver Cigar Makers Union voted to send 500 armed men to Ludlow in Trinidad. Women in the United Garment Workers Union in Denver announced 400 of their members had volunteered as nurses to help the strikers. All over the country there were meetings, demonstrations, pickets marched in front of the Rockefeller office at 26 Broadway in New York City. A minister protested in front of the church where Rockefeller sometimes gave sermons and was clubbed by the police. The New York Times carried an editorial on the events in Colorado, which were now attracting international attention. Oh, I'm sorry. The Times' emphasis was not on the atrocity that had occurred, but on the mistaken tactics that had been made. Its editorial on the Ludlow massacre began, "Somebody blundered." 2 days later, with the miners armed and in the hills of the mine district, the Times wrote, "With the deadliest weapons of civilization in the hands of savage-minded men, there can be no telling to what length the war in Colorado will go unless it is quelled by force. The president should turn his attention from Mexico long enough to take stern measures in Colorado." The governor of Colorado asked for federal troops to restore order, and Woodrow Wilson complied. This accomplished, the strike petered out. Congressional committees came in and took thousands of pages of testimony. The Union had not won recognition. 66 men, women, and children had been killed. Not one militiaman or mine guard had been indicted for crime. Still, Colorado had been a scene of ferocious class conflict, whose emotional repercussions had rolled through the entire country. The threat of class rebellion was clearly still there in the industrial conditions of the United States, in the undeterred spirit of rebellion among working people. Whatever legislation had been passed, whatever liberal reforms were on the books, whatever investigations were undertaken, and words of regret and conciliation uttered. The Times had referred to Mexico. On the morning that the bodies were discovered in the tent at Ludlow, American warships were attacking Veracruz, a city on the coast of Mexico, bombarding it, occupying it, leaving 100 Mexicans dead because Mexico had arrested American sailors and refused to apologize to the United States with a 21-gun salute. Wait, Mexico refused to do a 21-gun salute, so we attacked them? Could patriotic fervor and the military spirit cover up class struggle? Unemployment, hard times were growing in 1914. Could guns divert attention and create some national consensus against an external enemy? It surely was a coincidence. The bombardment of Veracruz, the attack on the Ludlow colony, Or perhaps it was, as someone once described human history, the natural selection of accidents. Perhaps the affair in Mexico was an instinctual response of the system for its own survival, to create a unity of fighting purpose among a people torn by internal conflict. The bombardment of Veracruz was a small incident, but in 4 months, the First World War would begin in Europe. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you join in the next episode. We'll see you then. Thank you. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe.